So, as said, we will talk about the guidance document for the production of reference materials with qualitative properties, and I will try to give you an introduction to ISO 33406. The full title of that document is Approaches for the Production of Reference Materials with Qualitative Properties. As it was said, it was released a few months ago this year in 2024. And I've put here the link to the ISO general web pages because I would like to encourage you to have a look and search for the document, because nowadays there's a little icon which says read sample, and ISO allows you to read upfront without buying the document quite something, namely the foreword, the introduction, the scope and the normative references and the biography, which tell already a lot. I must say I like this feature which ISO has enabled. It was mentioned already by several previous speakers. This document was developed within the Technical Committee 334, the Working Group 13, and I would like to share here with you that at the finalization of ISO 33406, we had 77 working group members, 13 standardization bodies represented, and 5 liaison representations. Among these 5 is worthwhile to mention here in this context Eurachem and the European Commission Joint Research Center, as this is my employer. Why do I want to emphasize that we were 77 working group members and 13 standardization bodies? Well, this is exactly the bottleneck we were facing in the beginning. So before 2015, we were not representing enough members or standardization bodies to be able to write a standard in these early years. And that is what I would like to come back, although it was mentioned by Angelique also, and shortly tell you a little bit of this history. We have in 2015 released a TR79, TR standing for Technical Report. That is a collection of examples of reference materials with qualitative properties, not necessarily certified. Some of them were what we call non-certified reference materials, so they had assigned values. It's a technical report, a collection of examples, but these examples have not gone through the classical ISO consensus building process. And I told you the reason: we were not representative enough to embark on standardization. Then ISO REMCO was in 2021 transformed into ISO TC334, so a technical committee, and that enabled us to start the standardization process, and that enabled us to what we are talking about today, the release of ISO 33406. This is an international standard, and it's a standard which provides guidance. And I will come back a bit on that in my next slide. So when we look at the whole landscape of reference material production, then we want to know how can we produce a reference material with quantitative property values, but we also, as we are discussing now, want to know how can we produce a reference material with qualitative properties. Certainly, ISO 17034 plays a role here, as the title says. It lists the general requirements for the competence of reference material producers, and as its general requirements, it covers quantitative reference material and qualitative reference materials. As it lists requirements, which must be met if you want to work according to ISO 17034, according to the ISO terms, the word shall is used to emphasize these requirements. Another important document is ISO 33405, which lists approaches for the characterization and assessment of homogeneity and stability. It is also, like ISO 33406, a guidance document which lists valid approaches, and certainly these approaches are applicable to quantitative reference materials, but it has also quite some interesting details, technical details related to qualitative reference materials, for instance about how to organize characterization studies and a part on documentary traceability. And last but not least, we have here ISO 33406, which was released this year, the approaches for the production of reference material with qualitative properties. In this document, we give guidance and we use the term should. So we recommend to the reference material producer what he should do if he wants to produce a qualitative reference material. You should be aware that there is a little bit of different terminology which is used if we look, if I may say so, the world of TC334, and on the other side, the Joint Guides for Metrology, so the JCGM. Within TC334, we have the ISO Guide 30, which is currently under revision, which lists the terms which are essential for reference material producer. And on the other hand, we have published by the JCGM Working Group 2, we have the VIM 3, which also at the moment is under revision, or the VIM 4 rather is under development. And you might have seen it because there were some ballotings taking place. And this VIM 4 has an additional chapter, the so-called Chapter 6, which is a chapter on nominal properties. And here you see already a little bit what the difference is. I will tell you more about that. First of all, you should know that ISO 33406 does not define any terms, so it doesn't define what a qualitative property is, but we do explain it in the introduction. We opted for this version because the terms are intended to be defined in ISO 33400, which is the successor document of the ISO Guide 30. So within ISO 33406, we speak about qualitative properties as a superordinate for nominal properties and ordinal properties. And we use categorical properties as a synonym for qualitative properties. What is then a nominal property? Well, that's a value of a set of materials which allows them to be divided into classes. And what you can do with the nominal property value or with that information is you can only compare them to each other. So you can say whether they are identical or they are different. Think of a fish reference material, for instance, which is certified for the qualitative property of being of a certain fish species. Then you can say, well, this is Polachius polachus, or it's different from the Polachius virens, but you cannot say much more. Likewise, we have ordinal properties. They allow a little bit more of comparison because here you can say whether one is lower, equal, or higher, but you can only compare them to each other. ISO 33406 has a focus on nominal properties. You may ask yourself, why is that? And I think the reason is that the majority of the reference material producers or the experts which were in our group, they're working with nominal properties, so reference material certified for their identity. So we simply didn't have the chance to broaden the scope of ISO 33406 at the current moment. In case you are following what is happening at the VIM level, I would like to share with you, or you will be aware, that the VIM uses the term examination when it talks about a determination focusing on a qualitative property. And within ISO 33406, we are using also the term examination and determination when we are carrying out qualitative analysis. So in that sense, we are not contradicting the VIM, but as I said, ISO 33406 doesn't define anything. When we look at the ISO 33406 document, certainly the most important part is the section 5, meeting technical and production requirements. Here, characterization studies, including traceability and confidence in qualitative values, is explained. And we have also the parts on assessing homogeneity, stability, and commutability. So ISO 33406 proposes different characterization approaches. It clearly emphasizes here are 4 approaches which you can use, but it doesn't say that they are exclusive. So there may be other approaches which you could use as well. The first one being you could use qualitative determinations. For instance, they can depend on a comparison with reference data or other value-assigned reference materials. You can characterize a qualitative property reference material based on provenance, meaning you have the knowledge of the origin of the material and you confirm by additional evidence. But you could also use measurements, and I really mean measurements here, so measurements of quantitative properties, which can then be used to characterize the identity of a reference materials. You have to, however, be aware as different substances can share the same measurement response, so the response to a quantitative measurement. Information about the source of the raw material is also vital. And last but not least, of course, you can also apply, or we recommend you can also apply a combination of these methods which are given here above. For instance, for chemical substances, it's often suitable to have combinations of methods. And a good example here is certainly the pharmacopoeia, which uses this approach for identifying chemical substances. ISO 33406 has an Annex A, and in there some examples of DNA sequence and protein reference materials are given, which illustrate these 2 of those approaches further. When we look at metrological traceability, we have to be aware that metrological traceability applies when we do a quantitative measurement. So of course, it's quite of logic that ISO 33406 notes that for quantitative measurements, measurement uncertainty and metrological traceability are relevant, like we are used to. And we have, of course, also ISO 17025, which applies in both cases, whether you do determinations of quantitative or qualitative value assignments. So in case you are using now here a quantitative measurement for assigning these values, 17 or 25 will also apply. Similarly, traceability, and that's the term we use in ISO 33406, applies, for instance, when a qualitative property value is established by comparison to a reference. And of course, ISO 33406 then recommends you should state the reference which you have been using for your comparison. Be aware that your reference will not be one of the classical types, so it will not be in a unit to the International System of Units, but it will be more a reference recognized by the relevant scientific community. So it can also be an artifact, or it can be authoritative data. Think of all these data banks listing DNA sequences, for instance, for fish speciation. And similarly, traceability applies also when you are assigning a qualitative property value depending on provenance. So the reference material producer is reminded that he should document this properly, because in the end you want to have a documentary chain which shows you what the origin of the material was. And also says, well, I think I said that already before, you can assign a qualitative property via assign it via the provenance of the material. We often refer to this as trackability. Measurement uncertainty applies also when a quantitative measurement is carried out. Of course, again, ISO 33406 notes that for quantitative measurements, measurement uncertainty plays a role beside the metrological traceability. And the ISO 33406 reminds that the measurement uncertainty needs to be sufficiently small if you want to have no significant impact on using such a measurement result for assigning a qualitative value, because otherwise you will not have enough confidence in assigning that qualitative value. So therefore, similarly in ISO 33406, we use instead of uncertainty confidence, and we use confidence to express the degree of belief that we have in the assigned qualitative property value. Of course, it is a fact that any assignment of a value to a property is surrounded by an uncertainty. But at the same time, we have the situation that there is no methodology existing for assigning uncertainty values to qualitative property values. And therefore, ISO 334 says that uncertainty statements remain optional. It, however, encourages the reference material producer to express the confidence they have in the assigned qualitative property value, because we deem it as very helpful for the reference material user. And at the same time, it is recommended that a reference material producer only certifies a reference material if there is sufficiently high confidence for the intended use. So in particular, if you have a qualitative property value and you want to certify it, then you should have high confidence in that, and the reference material producer should also explain why he has a high confidence in these values. So how can you now express confidence in quantitative properties? Principally, there are two ways. You can do this qualitatively using an ordinal scale, or you could do this quantitatively, for instance, via a likelihood ratio or probability distribution. And I would like to flag here the example we have in ISO 33406. That's the ginkgo biloba leaves. It's a NIST reference material, and it uses for expressing the confidence of its value an ordinal scale. Most confident, very confident, confident, and ambiguous. I don't want to go in further detail here, because I'm sure that in the second part of our sessions, we will hear more about it. And as I said, it's also an example in ISO 33406, namely in the Annex B. The document ISO 33406 also lists some general statistical considerations, while at the same time clearly saying, well, only a few statistical approaches have so far been widely used to the characterization of qualitative properties. So therefore, it focuses more on the advice of what features do your methods which you employ need to bring along. And one recommendation, for instance, is methods returning quantitative information should be preferred, provided you have them, of course. But the simple fact is that a quantitative measurement result contains more information than the qualitative examination result. Methods with a high reliability should be chosen. The reason for that being, if you don't have a high reliability of your method, you will have a problem in discriminating test failures, so false positive or false negatives, from defective reference materials. You will not be able to distinguish them. And last but not least, methods should be chosen in such a way that they accommodate for a low or zero proportion of discordant responses. This is also straightforward. If you think about it, you have a reference material certified for identity. You would actually expect that all of your individual units give a signal towards the qualitative property. Assessment of homogeneity. It should be assessed as a response to a test method which directly targets what the assigned nominal property value is. Or to other methods which are used listed in the intended use of the certificate, for instance. Assessing homogeneity is mandatory for all assigned values. That is a requirement from ISO 17034. And for test methods that return a qualitative result, and that is now written in ISO 33406, it's recommended to increase the number of units which are analyzed in order to have a narrow confidence interval and to have a better estimate for the proportion of defective units. And it is recommended to choose test methods with a negligible false response rate. Because they will allow you then that you do not require to do any replicate testing. There are some statistical approaches in ISO 33406. I've listed them here in this box. I don't want to go into details. The use of confidence interval, the inspection of attributes, the two-way contingency table analysis, and categorical analysis of variance, because you can find it in these documents, and I think it's easier later when we hear the practical examples to come back to those. ISO 33406 has in Annex D an example of the LGC meat species reference material. We'll hear about that one as well. But with this example, ISO 33406 applies some of these statistical approaches. Likewise, for the assessment of stability, should be assessed in the terms of stability as a response to the test methods, targeting the assigned qualitative property value. We have added here a sentence in ISO 334 reminding the reference material producer that it can be very helpful to provide information about the method which you have used for stability testing, because we wanted to acknowledge here the situation of the biobanks, where you often have biological material, but you do not yet know for which purposes they are used. So in the end, you need to backwards be able to check whether the stability of the property a user is interested in was really covered by a stability study or not. Again, assessment of stability is mandatory for all assigned values, and that's a requirement of ISO 17034. But then the need can arise that you do experimental stability studies also for qualitative property values, and that is then written down in ISO 33406. And the recommendation here is that you determine the change in proportion of units responding to the qualitative test methods, or that you employ investigating quantitative properties which can indicate that your material is degrading. Likewise, ISO 33406 has some statistical approaches: contingency table analysis, regression of failure probability, and survival analysis, and has again in Annex D the examples which employ some of these statistical approaches. Assessment of commutability. Well, the commutability of a reference material basically describes its suitability to use it as a calibrator or as a quality control material in a second measurement on a routine sample. So therefore, it is important to realize that commutability is also an issue for qualitative property reference materials. It is not that a qualitative property reference material that you may only use it as a positive or negative control, that you would not need to test commutability or not to know about it. It is mandatory, and even more, it is mandatory for reference materials used in vitro diagnostics. That's why ISO 33406 refers to ISO 15194, which clearly says you need to evaluate the commutability of certified reference materials used in vitro diagnostic. So logically, you need to do that for reference materials with quantitative property values, but also with qualitative property values. Commutability assessment should include one or more of the following approaches, and this is now what ISO 33406 says. First of all, the reference material producer should make some considerations and should think about if processing techniques or treatments of the reference material change the matrix in such a way that it could impact the behavior of the material, which is then an indication that it may not be commutable. You should review published literature data on commutabilities, which were already carried out, ideally those on closely related reference materials. And then the third approach, carry out a planned experiment to test the commutability, which is the ultimate proof of it. As I mentioned before, the ISO 33406 has several informative annexes. I don't want to go in detail here. I've mentioned them throughout my presentation, but we hope that they can be of practical help for the user of this ISO standard. And if we then look in the possible future, well, we have now TR79 with this collection of examples of qualitative reference materials. We have ISO 33406, which gives us approaches on how to produce a qualitative property reference material. Then one question which the Technical Committee 334 will ask itself soon in a ballot is about ISO TR79. The question is, do we want to maintain it? Do we want to retract it? Or is it maybe better to amend it or update it? Because there could be a reason of aligning these reference material examples with ISO 33406 to make it more valuable for the reader. And of course, in the even further future, sooner or later, we will have to revise ISO 33406. And the question is then, can we actually give more guidance? Or can we maybe amend it and extend it to the ordinal properties, which would be very useful? Or can we even go a step further on this standardization pathway and maybe move from guidance to more stringent requirements? And having said that, I would like to ask you, if you are active in this area of developing reference material with qualitative properties, please consider to join us in Working Group 13. As you see, we need some more experts. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. I would like to add a very big thank you to the numerous Working Group 13 members, because certainly without them, the document wouldn't exist. And also they were very patient members with me, especially in the finalization phase when I had to come several times back to them to have all these nasty questions answered. So thank you very much.